The floorboard creaked outside my door. In that suffocating darkness of my 12-year-old bedroom, I pressed myself deeper under the bed, my small body trembling against the dusty wooden floor. The smell of whiskey and hatred seeped through the crack beneath my door like poison. He was coming again. Clara. His voice, thick with alcohol and something darker, made my skin crawl. Grandpa knows you're awake, little princess. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to disappear into the shadows, to become nothing more than dust and silence. But prayers I had learned don't stop monsters. The doorknob turned with the slow deliberation of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. Good morning, my dear viewers. My name is Clara, though most of you know me as Grandma Clara. I'm 79 years old, and today I'm sharing a story that has lived in the darkest corners of my heart for 67 years. A story of terror survival, and ultimately the triumph of the human spirit over evil. If you're watching this, please know that what I'm about to tell you isn't easy to hear. But sometimes the most important truths are buried in the deepest pain. And sometimes sharing that pain can light the way for others lost in similar darkness. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel, not for an old woman's vanity, but because every subscription tells me that speaking this truth was worth the cost. I was born in Bakersfield, California in 1946 into what seemed like a perfect world. The war had ended. America was prosperous, and my family embodied the promise of that golden age. My father, Albert Martinez, was a respected railroad supervisor who wore his dignity like his pressed suits impeccably and without a wrinkle. He had fought in the Pacific, returned home to marry his sweetheart, and built what he believed would be an unshakable foundation for his family. My mother, Dorothy, taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary with the kind of gentle authority that made children bloom under her care. She had auburn hair that caught the light like copper pennies and a laugh that could fill our entire house with warmth. Neighbors would stop her on the street to tell her how their children adored her, how she made learning feel like magic instead of work. We lived in a sprawling Victorian house on Oak Street, painted yellow, with white trim, surrounded by my mother's prize-winning rose garden. The house had belonged to my mother's aunt, who left it to us when I was 5. It was 3 stories of polished hardwood floors, bay windows that caught the morning sun, and enough space for the large family my parents dreamed of having. But I was their only child, their miracle, after 2 heartbreaking miscarriages that left my mother weeping silently into her pillow when she thought no one could hear. The doctors had warned that another pregnancy might kill her, so all their hopes, dreams, and fierce protective love were concentrated on me. They called me their little princess, and I reveled in that role, dancing through childhood, wrapped in their adoration and the security of our middle-class respectability. Our days followed comfortable rhythms. Breakfast around the oak table in the kitchen with my father reading snippets from the Bakersfield Californian, while my mother packed my lunch in a tin box decorated with painted flowers. School, where being the teacher's daughter had its privileges, other teachers smiled at me indulgently even when I hadn't earned it. Afternoons playing in our backyard or with the neighborhood children games of hide-and-seek that could stretch until the streetlights came on. We had help, of course. Sarah Washington was our housekeeper, a warm woman in her 50s, who had been with our family since before I was born. She lived in the small apartment above the garage and treated me like the granddaughter she'd never had. Sarah told the most wonderful ghost stories, always with a moral tucked inside like a surprise in a birthday cake. She taught me to make cornbread from scratch, to iron my father's shirts with military precision, and to recognize the signs of changing weather by watching the clouds. Child. She'd say, kneading dough with strong, capable hands. The world's gonna try to tell you all sorts of things about who you are and what you're worth. But you remember this? You're fearfully and wonderfully made, and don't let nobody convince you otherwise. Sundays were magical in our household. We'd wake early for 8 o'clock Mass at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, where Father McKenna would nod approvingly at our family occupying the 3rd pew on the left, the same pew we'd claimed for as long as I could remember. My mother would dress me in my finest clothes, starched white dresses with ribbons that matched my patent leather shoes. my hair curled into perfect ringlets that she'd pin with small silk flowers. After Mass, we'd drive to my maternal grandmother's house for Sunday dinner, and that's where the magic truly began. Grandma Elizabeth lived in a rambling craftsman bungalow 6 blocks from the church, with a wraparound porch shaded by ancient oak trees and a backyard that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Her house always smelled of cinnamon and vanilla furniture polish, and the lavender sachets she tucked into every drawer and closet. Grandma Elizabeth was 72 years old, with silver hair she wore in an elegant chignon and eyes the color of forget-me-nots. She had immigrated from Ireland as a young bride, following her new husband to California, with nothing but a trunk of linens and an unshakable faith in the future. Her hands were always busy knitting, embroidering, or preparing the elaborate meals that brought our extended family together every week. But it was her chicken pot pie that made her legendary in our family. She'd start preparing it on Saturday, making the pastry from scratch, stewing the chicken with herbs from her garden, cutting vegetables with the precision of a surgeon. The smell would greet us before we even got out of the car, and my stomach would begin growling in anticipation. "There's my precious girl," she'd say, sweeping me into arms that smelled of flower and rose water. "Come help Grandma set the table for our feast." The dining room would fill with uncles, aunts, and cousins, sometimes as many as 20 people crowding around the massive mahogany table that had been her wedding gift from her own mother. Uncle Patrick, who worked at the oil refinery and always had grease under his fingernails no matter how much he scrubbed. Aunt Margaret, who taught piano and could make any song sound like a lullaby. Cousin Tommy, 2 years older than me, who pulled my braids and stole cookies when he thought no one was looking. But it was Grandpa William who held court at the head of that table, carving the roast with ceremony, while regaling us with stories of the old days. He was 70 years old, with snow-white hair and hands that told the story of decades working the earth. He'd been a farmer before retiring, and even in his 70s he maintained a vegetable garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. Clara, my dear," he'd say, slipping me the choicest pieces of meat, "you're growing prettier every week. Soon all the boys will be lining up at your door." He'd wink when he said it, and I'd giggle, basking in his attention. Grandpa William seemed to see something special in me that even my doting parents missed. He'd bring me gifts, not expensive things, but treasures nonetheless. A perfect peach from his orchard still warm from the sun. A wildflower he'd picked on his morning walk. A small wooden toy he'd carved himself during the long winter evenings. "This is for you, princess," he'd whisper, pressing the gift into my small hands. "Because you're the most special little girl in the whole world." Looking back now, I can see the signs that should have warned us. The way his gifts became more frequent and more personal. The intensity of his attention, which felt overwhelming even to my child's mind. The subtle way he'd position himself to always be near me during family gatherings. His hand resting on my shoulder or smoothing my hair with touches that lasted just a moment too long. But in 1957, when I was 11 years old, such things weren't discussed in polite society. Children were taught to respect their elders without question, to accept affection from family members as their due. The concept of inappropriate touching was rarely spoken of, and when it was, it came wrapped in euphemisms and whispered warnings that children couldn't fully understand. Besides this, was Grandpa William, the man who had worked himself nearly to death to provide for his family, who had been married to my beloved grandmother for 50 years, who led grace at every family dinner, and never missed Sunday Mass. The idea that such a pillar of respectability could harbor darkness was simply unthinkable. The first crack in our perfect world appeared in late 1957 when Grandma Elizabeth began complaining of pains that wouldn't go away. At first, we all dismissed it. She was 67 after all, and had been working hard her entire life. Surely a little rest and some of her own herbal remedies would set her right. But the pain didn't respond to rest or remedies. Instead, it grew teeth gnawing at her from the inside until she became a shadow of her former self. I watched my vibrant grandmother fade away like a photograph left in the sun, her appetite disappearing, her energy draining away, until she could barely make it through a Sunday dinner without having to lie down. "It's a tumor." I overheard my father telling my mother one night, his voice heavy with dread. "The doctor says it's spread throughout her body. There's nothing they can do except try to make her comfortable." 3 months. That's all the time cancer gave us to say goodbye. I was too young to fully understand what was happening, but I could feel the weight of impending loss settling over our family like a shroud. Sunday dinners became subdued affairs with hushed conversations and forced smiles as we pretended everything was normal for Grandma's sake. I remember the last conversation I had with her. She was propped up in her bed, looking impossibly small against the white pillows, her once bright eyes clouded with pain and medication. But when she saw me hesitating in the doorway, she managed to smile and pat the bed beside her. "Come here, my darling girl," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Grandma wants to tell you something important." I climbed carefully onto the bed, afraid I might hurt her with my weight. She took my hand in both of hers, and I was shocked by how fragile they felt, like bird bones wrapped in tissue paper. "You're going to grow up to be a remarkable woman," she said, her forget-me-not eyes looking directly into mine. "But the world isn't always kind to remarkable women. There will be people who try to dim your light, who want to make you small and afraid. Promise me you won't let them." I promised, though I didn't understand what she meant. How could I know that her words would prove prophetic, that the very man sitting in the chair beside her bed would be the one to try to destroy everything bright and beautiful about my childhood? She died on a Sunday in March 1958, just as the daffodils were beginning to bloom in her garden. The funeral was held at St. Joseph's, and it seemed like the entire town came to pay their respects. Grandma Elizabeth had taught Sunday school for 40 years, had organized countless charity drives, had opened her home to anyone in need. The church overflowed with mourners, and Father McKenna had to set up speakers in the parish hall to accommodate everyone who wanted to hear his eulogy. I sat between my parents in the front pew, wearing a black dress my mother had bought specially for the occasion, watching Grandpa William say goodbye to his wife of 50 years. He didn't cry loudly or dramatically, that wasn't his way. Instead, silent tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as he stared at the casket being lowered into the ground, and I felt my heart break for this lonely old man who had lost the center of his universe. In the weeks following the funeral, life tried to return to normal, but there was a shadow over our house that hadn't been there before. My mother was different, distant. She'd lost not just her mother, but her best friend, the woman who had guided her through marriage, motherhood, and all the small crises that make up a life. She tried to smile for my sake, but I could see the sadness that lived behind her eyes, now a grief that would never fully heal. My father did his best to hold our family together, taking on extra responsibilities around the house and trying to cheer my mother with small gifts and gentle attention. But he was dealing with his own grief. Grandma Elizabeth had treated him like the son she'd never had, and her loss left a hole in his life that nothing could fill. It was during this vulnerable time that Grandpa William began appearing at our house more frequently. At first, it seemed natural enough. He was grieving and lonely, and we were his only family in Bakersfield. His other children lived scattered across the country, busy with their own lives and unable to provide the daily support an elderly widower needed. "Your grandfather can't manage alone in that big house," my mother explained to me one evening as we watched him slowly make his way up our front walk, a covered dish in his hands. "He's been forgetting things, leaving the stove on, not taking his medication. Yesterday, Mrs. Patterson found him wandering around his neighborhood in his pajamas, completely confused about where he was." The decision to invite him to live with us wasn't made lightly. My parents discussed it for weeks, weighing the benefits against the disruption it would cause to our established routines. They worried about his increasing forgetfulness, his tendency to repeat stories, his old-fashioned ideas about child-rearing that sometimes clashed with their more modern approach. But in the end, family duty won out over personal convenience. In May 1958, Grandpa William packed his few belongings and moved into the small bedroom at the back of our house, the one that had originally been designed as a maid's quarters, but had been used for storage since Sarah lived above the garage. At first, his presence seemed like a blessing. He woke early every morning, earlier than any of us, and would have coffee percolating and breakfast half prepared by the time my parents stumbled downstairs. He fixed the dripping faucet in the kitchen that had been annoying my mother for months. He repaired the squeaky gate that led to our backyard and started a small vegetable garden in the corner where nothing had grown before. My father was impressed with his industriousness and grateful for the help around the house. "Your grandfather still has a lot of life in him," he'd say approvingly as we watched the old man work in the garden, his movements slow but purposeful. "Good honest work keeps a man young." But I began to notice things that the adults seemed to miss. The way my mother would find excuses to leave the room when Grandpa entered it. How she'd suddenly remember errands that needed running or phone calls that needed making whenever she found herself alone with him. The subtle tension that would creep into her shoulders when he addressed her directly, especially when my father wasn't around to serve as a buffer. Sarah noticed too. Our housekeeper, who had always been cheerful and talkative, became increasingly quiet around Grandpa William. I'd catch her watching him with suspicious eyes, and more than once I heard her muttering under her breath about old men who don't know their place. The changes in our household dynamics were subtle at first, like hairline cracks in a foundation that wouldn't become visible until much later. Grandpa William had opinions about everything: how the house should be run, what I should be learning, how my parents should be raising me. He'd been the undisputed head of his own household for 50 years, and adjusting to his new role as a dependent wasn't easy for him. "That girl needs more discipline." I'd hear him telling my father after I'd committed some minor transgression, like leaving my bicycle in the driveway or tracking mud through the kitchen. "In my day, children who disobeyed got the strap. All this talking and explaining just makes them soft." "Times are different now, Dad," my father would reply, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. There was something about Grandpa William's certainty, his absolute conviction that his way was the right way, that made even my usually decisive father second-guess himself. The gifts that had once been occasional treats became a daily occurrence. Every morning when I came down for breakfast, there would be something waiting beside my plate: a flower from his garden, a piece of candy from the jar he kept in his room, a small toy or trinket he claimed to have found at the 5 and dime store downtown. "You don't need to bring Clara presents every day, Dad," my mother said one morning, her voice carefully neutral, as she watched me unwrap yet another small doll, this one with yellow yarn hair and a dress made from fabric scraps. A man can't spoil his only granddaughter," Grandpa William replied, but there was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. "The child brings light to an old man's life. What harm is there in showing her some affection?" The harm I would learn was in the strings attached to that affection. The expectations that came with each gift, the sense of obligation that was being carefully cultivated in my young mind. But at 11 years old, I saw only kindness in his gestures, only love in his attention. How could I know that predators often begin their work with presents and praise, building trust and dependency before revealing their true intentions? It was Sarah who first tried to warn me, though her words were wrapped in riddles I couldn't understand at the time. We were in the kitchen one afternoon making cookies for a church bake sale when she suddenly stopped stirring the batter and looked at me with serious eyes. "Child," she said, her voice lower than usual, "you know the difference between good touches and bad touches, don't you?" I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure I did. Such things weren't discussed openly in our house, and my knowledge of inappropriate behavior was limited to vague warnings about strangers who might try to lure children away with candy or promises of puppies. "If anyone ever tries to touch you in ways that make you feel uncomfortable," Sarah continued, glancing toward the back of the house where Grandpa William was tending his garden, You scream as loud as you can and run to find your mama or daddy. Don't worry about being polite or not wanting to hurt someone's feelings. Your safety is more important than anyone's feelings. Do you understand me? I promised her I understood, but her words felt abstract, disconnected from my daily reality. Who would want to touch me inappropriately? Certainly not anyone in our family, and strangers weren't allowed in our house. Her warning floated in my consciousness like a half-remembered dream, important but not immediately relevant to my life. 2 weeks later, Sarah gave her notice. "I've found a position with a family downtown," she announced at dinner one evening, not meeting anyone's eyes as she spoke. "Better pay, and they're providing a proper apartment instead of just a room over the garage." My parents were shocked. Sarah had been with our family for over a decade, had helped raise me from infancy, was practically a member of the family. The idea that she would leave for a marginally better situation seemed completely out of character. "Sarah, if it's about money, we can discuss a raise," my mother said, genuine distress in her voice. "You know how much Clara loves you, how much we all depend on you." But Sarah shook her head firmly, still avoiding eye contact. "My mind's made up, Mrs. Martinez. I'll stay through the end of the month to help you find someone new, but then I'll be moving on." Later, as she helped me get ready for bed, Sarah pulled me aside for a private conversation. Her usually warm face was creased with worry, and she kept glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might overhear us. "Sweet girl," she said, kneeling down so she was at my eye level. "Remember what I told you about screaming if someone tries to touch you wrong? That's more important now than ever. You promised me you'll remember." I promised, though I still didn't understand why she seemed so frightened. It wasn't until years later, when I was old enough to recognize the signs, that I realized Sarah had seen something in Grandpa William's behavior that had terrified her into leaving. Some instinct, some recognition of predatory behavior had warned her that I was in danger. But in 1958, in our respectable middle-class household, such accusations were unthinkable. So instead of speaking directly, she tried to protect me with warnings and hoped for the best. Her leaving left a hole in our family that went far beyond the loss of household help. Sarah had been my confidant, my protector, my guide through the confusing world of growing up. Without her presence as a buffer, I found myself spending more time alone with Grandpa William, especially when my parents were at work. It was during these increasingly frequent periods of unsupervised time that his behavior began to change more noticeably. The gifts became more personal hair ribbons in colors he claimed brought out my eyes. Little pieces of jewelry, he said, made me look grown up. A diary with a lock that he presented with great ceremony. "Every young lady needs a place to keep her secrets," he said as he placed the small pink book in my hands. "But remember, secrets are meant to be shared with people who love you. Grandpa loves you more than anyone else in the world, Clara. More than your mama and daddy could ever love you." His words made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't articulate. Of course, my parents loved me. Their love was the foundation of my entire world. But there was something in the way he said it, some possessive quality, that made me feel like I was being claimed rather than cherished. The physical contact, which had always been part of his grandfatherly affection, began to feel different too. His hugs lasted longer than they should have, his hands lingering on my back and shoulders in ways that made my skin crawl. When he'd call me over to sit on his lap while he read the newspaper, I'd find his hands wandering to places they shouldn't go, casual touches that seemed accidental, but happened too frequently to be mistakes. "You're becoming quite the little lady," he'd murmur, his breath hot against my ear as I squirmed uncomfortably on his lap. "Soon you'll be old enough for a boyfriend, but they'll have to get past old Grandpa first, won't they?" I began making excuses to avoid these encounters, claiming homework or chores that needed my attention. But he was persistent, following me around the house with requests for help with small tasks or invitations to hear stories about his childhood that seemed to grow longer and more elaborate each time he told them. The breaking point came on a humid August evening when my parents had gone to a dinner party at my father's supervisor's house. Such events were important for my father's career, and attendance was essentially mandatory, but children weren't invited. They'd arranged for me to stay with Mrs. Henderson next door, but she'd called that morning to say she was feeling poorly and couldn't watch me. "Clara's old enough to stay home for a few hours," Grandpa William had volunteered. "I'll keep an eye on her, make sure she gets to bed on time." My parents had hesitated. I was only 12 after all, and they'd never left me home alone for an entire evening. But Grandpa William was family, a responsible adult who could handle any emergency that might arise. After much discussion, they'd agreed, extracting promises from both of us, that I'd be in bed by 9 o'clock and that nothing would disturb the neighbors. I watched from the living room window as their car disappeared down the street, a strange sense of foreboding settling over me like a heavy blanket. The house felt different with just the two of us in it, bigger somehow, and full of shadows that hadn't been there before. "Well, Princess," Grandpa William said from behind me, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. "It's just you and me now. How about we have some fun?" I turned to find him standing closer than I'd expected, close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath. He'd been drinking, which wasn't unusual. He often had a glass or two with dinner, but there was something different about him tonight. His eyes had a glassy quality, and his usual grandfatherly smile had been replaced by something that made my stomach clench with instinctual fear. "I should probably do my homework," I said, backing toward the stairs. "I have a book report due tomorrow." "Homework can wait," he said, moving to block my path to the staircase. "Grandpa wants to spend some quality time with his favorite girl. We never get to be alone together, do we? There's always someone else around, always someone interrupting us." He was right about that, but I'd never thought of it as a problem before. Now faced with his undivided attention in our empty house, I found myself desperately wishing for an interruption that wouldn't come. "Come sit with me on the sofa." He continued, his hand reaching out to take mine. "We can watch television together, just like a real grandfather and granddaughter should." His grip on my hand was firmer than it needed to be, and when I tried to pull away, his fingers tightened painfully around my wrist. I was trapped, and for the first time in my sheltered life, I understood that the adults who were supposed to protect me might sometimes be the ones I needed protection from. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare. He pulled me to the sofa, positioning me beside him with an arm around my shoulders that felt more like a cage than an embrace. His free hand began to wander, moving from my arm to my shoulder to places that no grandfather's hand should ever go. "You're growing up so fast," he murmured, his voice thick with something that made my skin crawl. "Such a pretty girl, such a special girl. Grandpa loves you so much, Clara, more than anyone else in the world." I tried to squirm away, but his grip tightened and his voice took on a warning tone. "Now, don't be shy, Princess. This is what families do when they love each other. This is our special secret, something just between you and me." The word secret triggered a memory of Sarah's warning, and suddenly I understood why she'd seemed so frightened, why she'd felt compelled to leave our family after so many years. She'd seen this coming, had tried to warn me in the only way she could, without making accusations that would have destroyed our family's reputation and her own livelihood. But understanding came too late to help me escape what was already beginning to happen. His touches became bolder, more invasive, accompanied by whispered words that I tried to block out of my mind even as they were being spoken. When I tried to protest, to tell him to stop, his hand covered my mouth with bruising force. "Quiet now." He hissed, his face so close to mine that I could see the yellowed teeth behind his smile. "Good girls don't make noise when their granddaddies are showing them love. And you are a good girl, aren't you, Clara?" I nodded because I had to, because the alternative was suffocation, because some primitive survival instinct told me that compliance might be the only thing that would get me through this alive. But inside, something was breaking, some essential part of my childhood that would never be whole again. When it was over, and it felt like hours had passed, though it had probably been only minutes, he straightened his clothes and smoothed down his hair, as if nothing had happened. The transformation was terrifying in its completeness. The predator who had just violated my innocence was gone, replaced once again by the kindly grandfather who carved wooden toys and brought me flowers from his garden. "Now remember, Princess," he said, his voice gentle but carrying an unmistakable threat. "This is our special secret, something just between us because we love each other so much. If you tell anyone about our special time together, they won't understand. They'll think you're a bad girl, a liar who makes up stories to get attention. And then I'd have to leave, and your mama and daddy would be so disappointed in you." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the final blow. "And if anyone tried to take me away from you, I'd have to hurt them to protect our love. I'd have to hurt your mama, maybe even your daddy. You wouldn't want that to happen, would you?" I shook my head, frantically, tears streaming down my face as the weight of his threats settled over me like chains. At 12 years old, I believed completely in his power to carry out those threats. He was an adult, an authority figure, someone who commanded respect and obedience from everyone in our family. If he said he would hurt my parents, then surely he could and would do exactly that. "That's my good girl," he said, patting my head with the same hand that had just violated me. "Now, go wash your face and get ready for bed. We don't want your parents to come home and find you looking upset, do we? They might ask uncomfortable questions, and we don't want to have to explain our special secret to them." I stumbled upstairs to my bedroom like a sleepwalker, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, expecting to see some visible sign of what I'd endured. But the face looking back at me was the same one I'd always known, slightly round, with my mother's green eyes and my father's stubborn chin. The damage was all internal, invisible to anyone who might have been able to help me. I ran a bath as hot as I could stand it and scrubbed myself until my skin was raw, trying to wash away the feeling of his hands on my body, the memory of his whiskey breath against my face. But no amount of soap and water could cleanse the shame that had settled into my bones, the certainty that I was now dirty in some fundamental way that could never be made clean again. When my parents returned home an hour later, I was in bed with the lights out, pretending to be asleep. I listened to their quiet conversation in the hallway as they checked on me, heard my mother's whispered comment about what a good girl I was, how mature and responsible I was becoming. If only she knew, I thought, fresh tears soaking into my pillow. If only she knew what her good girl had allowed to happen, what terrible secret she was now carrying. But I couldn't tell her. Grandpa William's threats echoed in my mind every time I considered confessing what had happened. The image of my parents being hurt because of my weakness, because of my failure to stop him, was more than my young mind could bear. So I carried the secret alone, and it grew heavier with each passing day. That night marked the beginning of a new existence for me, one split between the daylight world, where I was still Clara Martinez, the beloved daughter and promising student, and the nightmare world that emerged whenever I was alone with the monster who had taken up residence in our home. The line between those two worlds became increasingly blurred as the weeks passed, and his visits to my room became a regular occurrence. He was careful, strategic in his timing. He never came when there was any chance of being discovered, never left marks that couldn't be explained away as childhood accidents. He studied my parents' schedules like a general planning a campaign, striking only when he was certain of privacy and plenty of time to cover his tracks. Sometimes he would be gentle, almost loving, in his approach, bringing me gifts and speaking softly about how special our relationship was, how much he loved me. Other times, especially when he'd been drinking heavily, he was rough and cruel, leaving bruises that I learned to hide under long sleeves and high-necked dresses. "You belong to me now," he'd whisper during the worst of these encounters. "You're mine, Clara, and don't you ever forget it. I made you into a woman, and that gives me rights that nobody else will ever have." The psychological torture was even worse than the physical abuse. He took perverse pleasure in describing what he would do to my parents if I ever betrayed our secret, painting vivid pictures of violence that haunted my dreams and made it impossible for me to consider seeking help. He also began to convince me that I was complicit in what was happening, that my failure to fight back or scream for help made me equally guilty. "Look how your body responds to Grandpa's touch," he'd say with that terrible smile. "You like this, don't you, princess? You want this to happen. Good girls don't want such things, which means you must not be a good girl after all." I began to believe him. At 12 years old, I had no framework for understanding that victims often experience physical responses that have nothing to do with consent or desire, that the body's survival mechanisms can create reactions that feel like betrayal. I thought my inability to completely shut down during his assaults meant that I was somehow complicit, somehow deserving of what was happening to me. The changes in my behavior were gradual enough that they didn't immediately alarm my parents, though they did notice and comment on them. I became withdrawn, spending more time alone in my room rather than playing with neighborhood children. My grades began to slip as concentration became impossible. How could I focus on arithmetic when my mind was constantly occupied with fear and shame? I stopped eating regular meals, my appetite disappearing along with my joy in simple pleasures. Food tasted like ash in my mouth, and my stomach was constantly churned with anxiety and nausea. My mother attributed my weight loss to a growth spurt, pleased that her little girl was finally developing the lean build of a young lady. Sleep became elusive and treacherous. I would lie awake for hours listening for the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, terrified that each creak of the old house meant he was coming for me. When exhaustion finally claimed me, I was plagued by nightmares so vivid and disturbing that I would wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat and tears. "Just bad dreams, sweetheart," my mother would soothe, sitting on the edge of my bed and stroking my hair until my breathing returned to normal. "You're safe here. Nothing can hurt you in your own home." The irony of her words was like a knife twisting in my chest. My own home had become the most dangerous place in my world, and the person who was supposed to protect me was completely unaware of the predator living under our roof. As autumn gave way to winter, I found myself changing in ways that went beyond the physical and emotional trauma I was enduring. I became hypervigilant, constantly scanning my environment for signs of danger, studying the adults around me for any indication that they might harbor similar darkness. The innocent trust of childhood was gone forever, replaced by a wariness that made me feel decades older than my chronological age. I also developed an elaborate system of avoidance strategies, carefully tracking my parents' schedules and Grandpa William's habits to minimize the time I spent alone with him. I volunteered for extra chores that kept me busy, and visible joined after-school activities that extended my time away from home, and cultivated friendships with classmates whose houses could serve as refuges when I sensed danger approaching. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't avoid him entirely. He was patient, persistent, and terrifyingly intelligent in his manipulation. When direct opportunities weren't available, he found other ways to assert his control over me, subtle touches in public that looked grandfatherly but felt invasive private conversations where he reminded me of his threats, small gifts that came with strings attached, and expectations that made my skin crawl. "You've been avoiding Grandpa," he said one December morning when he cornered me in the kitchen before anyone else was awake. "That hurts my feelings, Princess, After everything we've shared together, after all the love I've shown you, this is how you repay me?" I mumbled some excuse about homework and school projects, not daring to meet his eyes. Even these brief encounters filled me with such terror that I could barely form coherent sentences. "Well," he continued, his voice taking on that familiar, threatening tone, "I think it's time we had another one of our special talks. Your parents are going to that Christmas party at the railroad company next weekend. They'll be gone for hours, and it'll be just you and me again. Won't that be nice?" The Christmas party. I'd forgotten about it, but now the date loomed in my mind like an execution. A whole evening alone with him, with nowhere to run and no hope of rescue. The knowledge that I had a week to dread what was coming made every day feel like a year. I considered running away, actually made it as far as packing a small bag and hiding it under my bed. But where could a 12-year-old girl go in 1958? I had no money, no transportation, and no adult I trusted enough to tell the truth about what was happening. The world beyond my family was full of strangers who might be even more dangerous than the devil I knew. I thought about suicide, though I didn't call it that at the time. I simply fantasized about not being there anymore, about disappearing into some peaceful place where hands couldn't touch me and voices couldn't threaten me. But even in my despair, something stubborn in me refused to give up completely. Some spark of the girl I'd been before this nightmare began still flickered inside me, and it whispered that this couldn't last forever, that somehow I would survive. The night of the Christmas party arrived with cruel inevitability. My parents left at 6 o'clock dressed in their finest clothes and excited about the evening ahead. They'd been looking forward to this event for weeks. It was the company's biggest social gathering of the year, and attendance was important for my father's standing with his supervisors. "Be good for Grandpa," my mother said, kissing my forehead as she adjusted her pearl necklace in the hall mirror. "We'll be home by midnight at the very latest." Midnight. 6 hours of hell stretching ahead of me like an eternity. I watched from the window as their car disappeared into the darkness, taking with it any hope of rescue or protection. "Well, well," Grandpa William said from behind me, his voice already thick with the whiskey he'd been drinking since dinner. "Here we are again, just the two of us. Isn't this cozy?" I turned to face him, and what I saw there made my blood freeze in my veins. The grandfatherly mask was completely gone, now replaced by something predatory and hungry that made him look like a stranger wearing a familiar face. His eyes glittered with anticipation, and his smile was the expression of a wolf contemplating a trapped rabbit. But something was different about me, too. Perhaps it was the weeks of living in constant terror, or maybe it was simply that I'd reached the limit of what I could endure in silence. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of anger alongside the fear. "I don't want to," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a note of defiance that surprised us both. His smile widened as if my resistance only added to his excitement. "Oh, but you don't get to choose anymore, princess. You gave up that right the first time you let Grandpa love you without fighting back. You're mine now, remember, my special girl." "I'm not your special girl," I said, my voice growing stronger despite the terror clawing at my throat. "I'm just a little girl, and what you're doing is wrong." The change in his expression was instantaneous and terrifying. The predatory smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury that made him look capable of violence beyond anything I'd yet experienced. "We're wrong," he snarled, taking a step toward me. "I'll tell you what's wrong. An ungrateful little bitch who doesn't appreciate the love she's been given. Maybe it's time you learned some respect." He lunged forward, grabbing my arm with enough force to leave bruises, and began dragging me toward the stairs. But this time, something inside me snapped. Instead of submitting as I always had before, I began to fight. I screamed as loudly as I could, hoping against hope that one of the neighbors might hear and come to investigate. I clawed at his hands with my fingernails kicked at his shins. With my feet threw my entire body weight backward in an attempt to break free from his grip. "Let me go!" I shrieked, my voice raw and desperate. "Get away from me! Help somebody help me!" But we lived on a quiet street where houses were set back from the road and separated by large yards. My screams were swallowed by the winter darkness, and no salvation came running to my rescue. Grandpa William's response to my resistance was swift and brutal. His hand connected with my cheek in a slap that snapped my head to the side and filled my mouth with the metallic taste of blood. The force of the blow sent me stumbling backward, and I would have fallen if not for his iron grip on my arm. That's enough," he growled, his voice carrying a dangerous edge I'd never heard before. "You want to fight like a little wildcat, fine, but you're going to learn that Grandpa always wins in the end." What followed was the worst assault I'd yet endured, made more traumatic by my failed attempt at resistance. He was no longer content with the submission I'd given him before. Now he demanded total surrender, complete acknowledgement of his power over me. The physical pain was excruciating, but the psychological damage was even worse. When it was over, I lay broken and bleeding on my bedroom floor, my nightgown torn, and my spirit crushed more completely than ever before. He stood over me, straightening his clothes and smoothing his hair with the calm precision of someone who had just completed a routine task. "This is what happens when you forget your place," he said conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather. "You belong to me, Clara. Your body, your future, your very life, all of it belongs to me now. The sooner you accept that, the easier things will be for everyone." He paused at the door, looking back at me with that terrible smile. "Clean yourself up before your parents get home. And remember, if you even think about telling anyone what happened here tonight, I'll make sure your mama and daddy pay the price for your disobedience. I'll hurt them in ways that will make what I did to you look like a gentle caress." After he left, I lay on the floor for what felt like hours, my body too damaged and my spirit too broken to move. Blood pooled beneath me, and I knew that this time the evidence of what he'd done couldn't be hidden or explained away. The physical trauma was too severe, the injuries too obvious. But even as I recognized the impossibility of concealing what had happened, I found myself planning exactly that. The terror he'd instilled in me was so complete, his threats so vivid and believable, that I would rather die than risk bringing harm to my parents. So I dragged myself to the bathroom, cleaned the blood from my body as best I could, and tried to devise a story that would explain my injuries without revealing their true cause. I was still trying to formulate a plan when I heard my parents' car in the driveway. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I possessed, and I managed to get myself cleaned up and into bed just minutes before they came upstairs to check on me. My mother peeked into my room, saw what she thought was her peacefully sleeping daughter, and whispered goodnight to the darkness. If only she had turned on the light, if only she had looked more closely, if only I had found the courage to call out to her, to beg for help, despite my terror of the consequences. But I didn't, and the moment passed, and another opportunity for rescue slipped away into the night. The next few days passed in a haze of pain and confusion. I told my parents I was feeling sick, which wasn't entirely a lie, and stayed home from school. My mother fussed over me, bringing me soup and tea, checking my temperature, and worrying about whether she should call the doctor. "Maybe it's just the flu that's been going around," she said, feeling my forehead with cool fingers. "But if you're not better by tomorrow, I'm making an appointment with Dr. Patterson." The thought of a medical examination terrified me almost as much as Grandpa William himself. How could I explain the bruises, the tearing, the evidence of violence that my body carried? How could I submit to the probing questions that would inevitably follow such a discovery? But as the days passed and my physical injuries began to heal, a strange thing happened. Instead of feeling relief, I found myself sinking deeper into despair. The healing of my body only emphasized the permanence of the damage to my spirit. The knowledge that I would never again be the innocent child I'd been before this nightmare began. I also began to realize that his threats weren't empty posturing, but promises he fully intended to keep. During the few interactions we had in those days following the assault, his eyes held a satisfied gleam that chilled me to the bone. He'd established his dominance over me so completely that he no longer needed to use force or even direct threats. A single look, a casual comment about my parents' safety, was enough to ensure my continued silence and cooperation. January 1959 brought a new horror to my existence: the return to school and the necessity of pretending that everything was normal. Sitting in classrooms, interacting with teachers and classmates, participating in the daily routines of childhood, felt like wearing a costume that no longer fit. I was no longer one of them, no longer truly a child, and the disconnect between my outward appearance and inner reality was almost unbearable. My grades, which had already been slipping, took a precipitous dive. Teachers who had once praised my intelligence and participation now looked at me with concern and disappointment. I overheard Mrs. Patterson telling another teacher that I seemed to have lost all interest in learning, that perhaps I was going through some kind of phase that would pass with time. If only they knew what kind of phase I was going through. If only any of the adults in my life had the knowledge or wisdom to recognize the signs of what was happening to me. But in 1959, such awareness was rare, and the symptoms of sexual abuse in children were often attributed to other causes or simply dismissed as normal growing pains. February brought new terrors and new violations, each one chipping away another piece of the girl I'd once been. Grandpa William had grown bolder, more confident in his power over me, and his assaults became more frequent and more creative in their cruelty. He seemed to take particular pleasure in forcing me to participate in my own degradation, in making me complicit in acts that filled me with self-loathing. "See how much you love Grandpa," he would whisper during these encounters. "See how your body responds to my touch? You can't fool me, princess. I know what you really are underneath all that innocent pretense." I began to believe him. At 12 years old, with no understanding of trauma responses or the psychological manipulation tactics he was employing, I interpreted my body's survival mechanisms as evidence of my own corruption. I thought the fact that I could still walk and talk and function in daily life meant that I wasn't really a victim, that I was somehow choosing to participate in my own destruction. This self-blame became another prison, another reason why I couldn't seek help or reveal what was happening. How could I tell my parents that their beloved daughter was not the innocent child they believed her to be, but something dirty and broken that had allowed herself to be defiled? How could I shatter their faith in me by revealing the truth about what I'd become? The winter seemed to last forever, each day blending into the next in an endless cycle of fear, violation, and despair. I began to fantasize about death, not as an escape, but as a punishment I deserved for my weakness and complicity. I would lie awake at night imagining various scenarios: accidents that would look random, illnesses that would take me slowly but surely, anything that would remove me from the world without requiring me to make an active choice about ending my life. But even in the depths of my despair, some stubborn spark of survival kept flickering inside me. Perhaps it was the memory of Grandma Elizabeth's final words about not letting anyone dim my light, or maybe it was simply the basic human instinct to endure whatever life throws at us. Whatever the source of that strength, it kept me going through the darkest months of my childhood. March brought the first signs of spring, and with them a subtle shift in the dynamics of our household. My father had been offered a promotion that would require us to relocate to Phoenix, Arizona, where the railroad company was expanding its operations. The possibility of escape of leaving Bakersfield, and all its terrible associations behind, filled me with hope for the first time in months. But Grandpa William seemed to sense my renewed optimism, and he moved quickly to crush it. Phoenix, eh? He said during one of his nocturnal visits to my room. That's awfully far from California. Your parents might think they can take you away from Grandpa, but they're wrong. Distance doesn't change what you are, Princess. Distance doesn't wash away the things you've done or the person you've become. His words were like ice water poured over the fragile hope I'd been nurturing. Even if we moved, even if we put hundreds of miles between us and this house of horrors, I would still carry the damage he'd inflicted. I would still be the broken, dirty thing he'd made me, and that knowledge would follow me wherever I went. April arrived with its promise of renewal and rebirth, but for me, it brought only the continuation of a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The assaults continued with their awful regularity, and I had long since stopped fighting or hoping for rescue. I existed in a state of numb resignation, going through the motions of daily life, while my spirit retreated deeper and deeper into some unreachable place where pain couldn't follow. It was during this period of complete despair that something happened that would change everything. Not rescue, that was still months away, but a small act of defiance that would plant the seeds of my eventual liberation. I had been keeping a diary, the one Grandpa William had given me months earlier, with his twisted comment about secrets being meant to be shared. In it, I had been recording my thoughts and feelings, though never the specific details of what was happening to me. The entries were cryptic coded in language that a child might use to describe confusion and sadness without revealing their true source. But on a rainy April afternoon, something inside me snapped. Perhaps it was the cumulative weight of months of abuse, or maybe it was simply the normal human need to bear witness to our own suffering. Whatever the cause, I found myself writing the truth for the first time since this nightmare began. He came again last night. I wrote, my hand shaking as I formed the words. Grandpa hurt me like he always does, and I couldn't stop him. I wanted to scream for Mama and Daddy, but he said he would kill them if I made any noise. I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret. I don't know how much more I can take. Just writing those words felt like an enormous release, a tiny crack in the wall of silence that had been suffocating me. I wrote more, describing my fear and pain and confusion in language that was simple but heartbreaking in its honesty. For the first time in months, I felt like I was telling the truth about my existence, even if the only audience was a blank page. I hid the diary better after that, creating an elaborate concealment system that involved hollowing out an old book and hiding it behind other volumes on my bookshelf. The act of writing became a lifeline, a way of preserving some essential part of myself that the abuse couldn't touch. Even if no one else ever read those words, they existed as proof that I had survived, that some part of me remained unbroken, despite everything that had been done to me. May brought warmer weather and the growing certainty that we would indeed be moving to Phoenix. My father had accepted the promotion and plans were being made for our relocation. The house would be sold, our belongings packed, and we would start fresh in a new city where no one knew our story. The prospect of leaving Bakersfield filled me with conflicting emotions. On one hand, it represented hope, the possibility of escaping the daily horror of my existence, of finding some way to heal from the damage that had been inflicted. On the other hand, it terrified me to think that Grandpa William might be coming with us, that the nightmare would simply continue in a new location. Whoa, what about Grandpa? I asked my mother one evening as we discussed the upcoming move. Will he be coming to Phoenix too? We haven't decided yet. She replied, though something in her tone suggested that the decision had already been made. The doctors think the climate might be good for his health, but it would mean leaving all his friends and familiar surroundings behind. I held my breath, waiting for more information, hoping against hope that some miracle might separate us permanently. But no such luck was forthcoming, and I spent the next several weeks in an agony of uncertainty about what the future might hold. It was during this period of limbo that the discovery finally came. Not because I found the courage to speak up, but because my body finally betrayed the secret I'd worked so hard to keep hidden. The assault that led to my liberation was particularly violent, even by the standards of what I'd endured over the previous months. Grandpa William had been drinking heavily all day, commemorating some anniversary that existed only in his twisted mind, and his attack was more savage than anything I'd yet experienced. When it was over, I was left with injuries that couldn't be hidden or explained away. Deep bruises that covered my arms and torso, scratches that looked like what they were, defensive wounds from a struggle, and internal damage that made it impossible for me to walk normally or sit comfortably. I tried to hide the evidence, as I always had, but the damage was too severe this time. My attempts to cover the bruises with long sleeves and high necklines weren't entirely successful, and my obvious discomfort couldn't be dismissed as normal adolescent moodiness. It was my mother who finally saw what had been happening right under her nose for so many months. She came into my room early one morning to wake me for school, and when she pulled back the covers to rouse me from sleep, she saw the full extent of my injuries. Her scream of horror and rage woke the entire household and marked the end of my long imprisonment in silence. The sound that emerged from her throat was primal, the cry of a mother discovering that her child had been brutalized while under her protection. It was a sound I'll never forget, and one that still haunts my dreams more than 60 years later. "My God, Clara!" She cried, her hands hovering over my battered body as if afraid to touch me. "Who did this to you? What happened?" I couldn't speak. After so many months of enforced silence, the words seemed locked away forever. But my mother's eyes moved over my injuries with the growing understanding of someone who had been willfully blind, finally being forced to see. "It was him, wasn't it?" she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "It was my father. Oh, my sweet baby, what has he done to you?" My silence was answer enough. The truth hung in the air between us, like a living thing, too terrible to be spoken, but too obvious to be denied. My mother gathered me into her arms, and for the first time in months, I felt truly safe. My father appeared in the doorway, drawn by my mother's scream, and when he saw us, his wife holding his broken daughter, both of us crying, something fundamental shifted in his face. The gentle man I'd known my entire life was replaced by someone capable of violence, someone who could kill to protect his family. He left the room without a word. I heard his heavy footsteps marching toward the back of the house, then raised voices crash as the sound of a struggle. When he returned 10 minutes later, his knuckles were bloody, and his eyes held a coldness I'd never seen before. "He's gone," he said simply. "Thrown out like the garbage he is. He'll never set foot in this house again." But even as relief flooded through me, I knew that the nightmare wasn't over. Grandpa William had been driven away, but the damage he'd inflicted would take much longer to heal. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wouldn't stay gone forever. I was right to be afraid. Monsters, I would learn, have a way of coming back when you least expect them. The weeks following the discovery were a blur of doctors' police interviews and therapy sessions that seemed to do more harm than good. Everyone wanted to help, but no one really understood what I'd been through or how to undo the damage that had been done. The well-meaning questions of adults who had never experienced such trauma felt like additional violations, forcing me to relive my suffering over and over again for an audience of strangers. The police were particularly frustrating. They approached the case with the skepticism that was common in that era, when children's testimony was often viewed as unreliable and sexual abuse within families was considered too shameful to be discussed openly. They interviewed me multiple times, asking the same questions in different ways, apparently trying to catch me in some inconsistency that would prove my story was fabricated. "Are you sure you're remembering correctly?" Detective Morrison asked during one particularly grueling session. "Sometimes children imagine things or they misunderstand what adults are doing. Are you certain your grandfather intended to hurt you?" The implication that I might have misunderstood or imagined months of systematic abuse was almost more damaging than the original trauma. It reinforced the shame and self-doubt that Grandpa William had so carefully cultivated, making me question my own perceptions and memories. Dr. Patterson, our family physician, was more supportive, but equally limited by the understanding of trauma that existed in 1959. He treated my physical injuries with professional competence, but seemed at a loss when it came to addressing the psychological damage. His recommendation was rest time and the love of my family well-intentioned advice that failed to acknowledge the complexity of what I was dealing with. "Children are resilient," he told my parents after examining me. "With proper care and time to heal, she should recover completely. The important thing is to not dwell on what happened to help her move forward and put this behind her." The idea that I could simply put this behind me and move on as if nothing had happened was both naive and harmful. But it reflected the prevailing attitude of the time when psychological trauma was poorly understood and victims were often expected to simply get over their experiences without proper support or treatment. Meanwhile, the search for Grandpa William intensified. He had vanished from Bakersfield as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving no trace of where he might have gone or what his intentions might be. Some thought he'd fled to Kentucky, where he'd been born and might still have distant relatives. Others believed he'd headed west to Los Angeles, where he could disappear into the anonymity of a large city. But I knew him better than any of them. I knew his rage, his sense of entitlement, his absolute conviction that I belonged to him. He hadn't fled out of shame or fear of consequences. He'd retreated to plan his next move, to figure out how to reclaim what he considered his property. The decision to accelerate our move to Phoenix was made partly out of practical necessity. My father's new position couldn't wait indefinitely, but mostly out of a desperate hope that distance might provide the safety that had been so cruelly stolen from us. If we could just get far enough away, my parents reasoned, we could start over and leave this nightmare behind us. But as we packed our belongings and prepared to leave the only home I'd ever known, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't escaping so much as delaying the inevitable. Grandpa William's threats still echoed in my mind, and I knew that his need to possess and control me wouldn't be diminished by mere geography. The move to Phoenix took place in early June 1959, just as the desert summer was beginning to show its brutal teeth. Our new house was smaller than the one we'd left behind, a modest ranch-style home in a development that had been built to accommodate the city's rapidly growing population. It was clean and modern, with none of the Victorian charm of our Bakersfield home, but it felt safer somehow unmarked by terrible memories, free from the shadows that had haunted every corner of my childhood bedroom. My parents had hoped that the change of scenery would help me heal, and to some extent it did. The desert landscape was so different from the Central Valley that it felt like we'd moved to another planet entirely. The searing heat, the stark beauty of the saguaro cacti, the vast blue sky unmarked by clouds, all of it seemed to offer the possibility of transformation, of becoming someone new. I enrolled in a local middle school for what remained of the academic year, and the anonymity of being a new student provided a blessed relief from the pitying looks and whispered conversations that had followed me in Bakersfield. Here I was, just Clara Martinez from California, a quiet girl who kept to herself and didn't cause any trouble. But the healing process was far more complex than simply changing addresses. The damage that had been inflicted went far deeper than my parents understood, affecting not just my ability to trust others, but my fundamental sense of self-worth and identity. I had nightmares almost every night, violent dreams where faceless monsters chased me through endless corridors while I searched desperately for somewhere to hide. My relationship with my parents, though loving, was complicated by the guilt and shame I still carried. I could see the pain in their eyes when they looked at me, the knowledge that they had failed to protect me from harm that had occurred right under their own roof. Their overprotectiveness, while understandable, sometimes felt suffocating. I was never allowed to be alone, never permitted to walk anywhere by myself, never given the normal freedoms that other children my age took for granted. The therapy sessions in Phoenix were marginally better than those in Bakersfield, mainly because Dr. Helen Morrison was one of the few psychologists in the area who had any experience dealing with childhood trauma. She was a kind woman in her 50s who had studied under some of the pioneers in the field, and she brought a level of understanding and compassion to our sessions that had been lacking in my previous treatment. "What happened to you was not your fault," she told me during our first meeting, her voice gentle but firm. "Nothing you did or didn't do caused this to happen. The responsibility lies entirely with the adult who chose to hurt you." Those words were like water to someone dying of thirst. For the first time since the abuse began, an adult was telling me that I wasn't to blame for what had happened, that I didn't deserve the treatment I'd received. It would take many more sessions for me to truly internalize that message, but it was a beginning. Through the summer and into the fall, I slowly began to reclaim small pieces of my former self. I made a few tentative friendships at school, joined the choir because I'd always loved to sing, and started reading voraciously as a way of escaping into other worlds where 12-year-old girls didn't have to worry about being hurt by the people who were supposed to love them. My parents, seeing these signs of improvement, allowed themselves to believe that the worst was behind us. They talked about the future high school, college, the career I might choose when I grew up. For brief moments, it was possible to imagine that we had truly escaped, that the nightmare we'd lived through in Bakersfield was nothing more than a terrible memory that would fade with time. But I never quite managed to convince myself that we were safe. Some primitive instinct, honed by months of hypervigilance, kept me constantly alert for signs of danger. I would check and recheck the locks on our doors and windows, study the faces of strangers for any resemblance to the monster who had stolen my childhood, and wake up in the middle of the night with the certainty that someone was watching me from the shadows. My fears proved to be well-founded. In November 1959, exactly 1 year after the abuse had begun, Mrs. Patterson from our old neighborhood in Bakersfield called my mother with disturbing news. "Dorothy," she said, her voice tight with worry, "I thought you should know people have been asking questions about you and Albert and Clara. A man came by last week claiming to be a relative trying to get in touch. He seemed to know an awful lot about your family, but something about him didn't feel right." My mother's face went white as she listened to the rest of Mrs. Patterson's report. The man had been elderly with a full beard and weathered hands, but his eyes had been cold and calculating. He'd asked specific questions about where we'd moved, what Albert's new job was, whether we'd left any forwarding address with the neighbors. "I didn't tell him anything," Mrs. Patterson assured my mother. "But I'm worried he might try other sources. You know how small towns are. If he asks enough people, he might eventually find someone who knows something." After hanging up the phone, my mother sat in silence for several long minutes, staring at the wall as if it might provide answers to questions she didn't want to ask. When my father came from work that evening, she shared Mrs. Patterson's warning, and I watched the color drain from his face as the implications sank in. "He's looking for us," my father said quietly, glancing toward me as if afraid I might overhear. "After all this time, he's still trying to find Clara?" "Well, what do we do?" my mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep running forever. We can't live our entire lives looking over our shoulders." But that's exactly what we did, at least for the next several months. My parents contacted the Phoenix police and updated them on the situation, but there was little the authorities could do based on second-hand reports of a suspicious inquiry. They increased patrols in our neighborhood and advised us to be extra vigilant, but the primary responsibility for our safety rested with us. The knowledge that Grandpa William was actively searching for us cast a shadow over what should have been a period of continued healing. Just when I was beginning to feel safe, to believe that I might actually have a normal life, the specter of his return loomed over us like a storm cloud. I started having nightmares again, violent dreams where he found our house and continued where he'd left off, picking up his campaign of abuse, as if no time had passed at all. Winter in Phoenix was mild compared to what we'd left behind in California, but the fear that gripped our household was more chilling than any weather. We installed additional security measures, better locks, a burglar alarm, motion sensor lights that would illuminate anyone approaching the house after dark. My father even purchased a gun, something he'd never owned before, and took lessons at a local shooting range. I won't let him hurt my family again, he told my mother one evening when he thought I was asleep. If that monster shows up here, I'll be ready for him. The months passed slowly each day, bringing the possibility that this might be the one when our fragile peace would be shattered. I tried to continue with normal teenage activities, school friends, the choir performances that had become one of my few sources of joy, but the constant undercurrent of fear made it difficult to fully engage with life. Spring arrived early in 1960, and with it came a false sense of security. The immediate threat seemed to have passed, and my parents began to relax their vigilance slightly. They allowed me to walk to school alone again, to spend time at friends' houses without constant supervision to reclaim some of the independence that fear had stolen from me. It was a mistake that would nearly cost us everything. The attack came on a humid evening in early June, exactly 2 years after we'd fled Bakersfield. My parents had gone to a company barbecue at my father's supervisor's house, an important social event that they couldn't miss without damaging his career prospects. They'd arranged for me to stay with our neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, but she'd called that afternoon to say she was feeling ill and couldn't watch me. Clara's old enough to stay home for a few hours. My mother said, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice, "She has our number, and the Rodriguez family is right next door if she needs anything." I assured them I'd be fine, that I'd lock all the doors and stay inside until they returned. They left, reluctantly extracting promises that I'd call immediately if anything seemed amiss, and I settled in for what I expected to be a quiet evening of homework and television. I was in the kitchen making myself a sandwich for dinner when the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and for a moment I assumed it was just a routine outage that would be restored quickly. But something about the timing felt wrong, and a chill of premonition ran down my spine. I was fumbling in the drawer for a flashlight when I heard the soft sound of glass breaking somewhere at the back of the house. My blood turned to ice as I realized that the power outage might not have been accidental, that someone had cut the lines as a prelude to breaking in. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept toward the back door to investigate. The kitchen window that faced the backyard had been broken, and through the jagged hole, I could see a dark shape moving in the shadows. Someone was definitely trying to get into our house, and I had a terrible suspicion about who it might be. I ran to the living room and grabbed the phone, but the line was dead cut, like the power by someone who had planned this intrusion carefully. Panic began to set in as I realized I was completely isolated, with no way to call for help and nowhere to run. That's when I heard his voice, muffled by the walls, but unmistakably familiar. "I know you're in there, Princess," Grandpa William called from somewhere near the back door. "Grandpa's come a long way to see his special girl. Aren't you going to invite me in?" The sound of his voice after nearly 2 years was like a punch to the stomach, bringing back every terrible memory I'd tried so hard to suppress. He was real. He was here. And he'd found us despite all our precautions. I heard him working on the back door, probably using tools he'd brought with him to defeat the locks my father had installed. It would only be a matter of minutes before he gained entry, and then I'd be trapped in the house with the monster who had destroyed my childhood. But I wasn't the same helpless 12-year-old girl he'd victimized in Bakersfield. 2 years of therapy, 2 years of growing stronger and more confident, had changed me in ways that even I didn't fully realize. The terror was still there, but alongside it was something new, a fierce determination not to be a victim again. I ran to my parents' bedroom and retrieved the gun my father kept in his nightstand. my hands shaking as I checked to make sure it was loaded the way he'd taught me during our trips to the shooting range. I'd never imagined I might actually have to use it. But the lessons came back to me now with crystal clarity. The sound of the back door opening sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. He was inside the house now, moving through the darkness with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and what he intended to do when he got there. "Clara," he called, his voice sickeningly sweet. Come out wherever you are. Grandpa has missed you so much. We have a lot of catching up to do." I positioned myself at the top of the stairs where I'd have a clear view of anyone climbing toward the second floor. The gun felt impossibly heavy in my hands, but I gripped it tightly and tried to remember everything my father had taught me about aim and trigger control. His footsteps moved through the house below me, slow and deliberate, as he checked each room systematically. He was taking his time, savoring the hunt, confident that I had nowhere to run and no way to fight back. In a few more minutes, he would start up the stairs, and then we would see which of us had changed more during our 2 years apart. "I found your diary, you know," he called out, his voice echoing from the kitchen. "The one you hid so carefully in that book. Such interesting reading, Princess. All those details about our special times together. Did you really think you could use that against me someday?" The knowledge that he'd violated even that private refuge, that he'd read the words I'd written to try to make sense of my suffering, filled me with a rage that burned away the last traces of fear. This monster had taken my innocence, my sense of safety, my ability to trust, but he would not take my future. I heard him start up the stairs, his footsteps heavy on the wooden treads. Each step brought him closer to the confrontation I'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. When his head appeared at the top of the staircase, illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the hallway window, I was ready for him. He looked older than I remembered, his hair completely white now, and his face gaunt from what had probably been a hard 2 years of hiding and running. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, and hungry, with an appetite that nothing could satisfy. "There's my beautiful girl," he said, smiling that terrible smile I remembered so well. "You've grown up so much, Clara. You're even prettier than I remembered." "Stop right there," I said, raising the gun and pointing it directly at his chest. "Don't come any closer." His smile widened, as if my resistance only added to his excitement. "Oh, Princess, you don't want to do that. You don't want to hurt your old grandpa, do you? Not after all the love we've shared together." Love." I laughed, and even to my own ears, the sound was bitter and harsh. "You call what you did to me love? You destroyed my childhood. You ruined my life. And you call it love?" "You'll understand someday," he said, taking another step up the stairs. "When you're older, when you've had time to think about it properly, you'll realize that everything I did was out of love. Pure, perfect love that nobody else could give you." "You're sick," I told him, my voice steady despite the emotions raging inside me. "What you did was evil, and you deserve to rot in hell for it." His expression changed, then the mask of grandfatherly affection slipping away to reveal the monster underneath. "You ungrateful little bitch," he snarled. "After everything I've done for you, after all the sacrifices I've made, this is how you repay me." "Well, it doesn't matter. You're coming with me whether you like it or not. We're going to finish what we started, you and I." He lunged up the remaining steps, moving with surprising speed for a man his age. But I was ready for him. The gun bucked in my hands as I pulled the trigger, the sound of the shot deafening in the enclosed space of the hallway. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling back down the stairs. He hit the bottom with a sickening thud and lay still, blood pooling beneath his crumpled form. For a moment, I thought I'd killed him, and I felt a mixture of relief and horror at the possibility. But then I saw his chest rising and falling, heard the ragged sound of his breathing. He was alive, but badly wounded, and no longer a threat. I ran downstairs and used Mrs. Rodriguez's phone to call the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the numbers. Within minutes, the house was filled with sirens and flashing lights paramedics working to stabilize Grandpa William, while police officers took my statement and tried to piece together what had happened. My parents arrived just as the ambulance was pulling away, their faces white with shock and fear. They'd been at the barbecue when Mrs. Rodriguez called to tell them about the commotion at our house, and they'd broken every speed limit getting home. "Are you hurt?" my mother asked, gathering me into her arms and holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. "Did he touch you? Did he hurt you?" I assured her that I was physically unharmed, that I'd been able to defend myself before he could complete whatever plan he'd had for me. But emotionally, the confrontation had opened old wounds that I'd thought were finally beginning to heal. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Grandpa William survived his injuries, but was left permanently disabled, his right arm nearly useless, and his mobility severely impaired. He was charged with breaking and entering, attempted kidnapping, and violation of the restraining order that had been issued after our original complaint in California. His trial was a media sensation, one of the first cases in Arizona where a child had successfully defended herself against an adult predator. The prosecutor painted him as a monster who had terrorized his own family, while his defense attorney tried to portray him as a confused old man who was suffering from dementia and didn't understand the consequences of his actions. I had to testify again, recounting the original abuse and explaining the events that led to the shooting. It was excruciating to relive those memories in open court, but I felt stronger now, more capable of speaking my truth without shame or fear. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Grandpa William was sentenced to 15 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for a man his age and in his condition. As he was led away in shackles, he turned to look at me one final time. But instead of the hatred or threats I expected, I saw something different in his eyes: defeat finally, and the acknowledgement that his power over me was broken forever. He died in prison 3 years later, succumbing to a heart attack while serving his sentence. When my mother called to tell me the news, I felt something I hadn't expected, not relief or satisfaction, but a profound emptiness, as if a chapter of my life had finally closed. The years that followed were a time of genuine healing and growth. With the threat of Grandpa William permanently removed, I was finally able to begin the process of rebuilding my life on my own terms. I finished high school with honors, earned a scholarship to Arizona State University, and discovered a passion for education that would shape my career for the next 4 decades. It was in college that I met Robert, a gentle young man from a loving family who saw past my scars to the woman I was becoming. Our courtship was slow and careful, complicated by my difficulty with trust and intimacy, but his patience and understanding helped me learn that not all men were predators, that love could be tender and healing instead of violent and destructive. We married 2 years after graduation, and I discovered that physical intimacy could be beautiful when it was based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Our wedding night was a triumph over the damage that had been inflicted on me so many years earlier, proof that healing was possible even after the most devastating trauma. We raised 3 children together, Michael, Sarah, and Elizabeth, named for the grandmother, whose death had inadvertently opened the door to my suffering. Each of them was precious to me in ways that went beyond normal parental love, living proof that I had not only survived my ordeal, but had triumphed over it. I taught elementary school for 35 years, bringing to my classroom a special sensitivity to children who seemed withdrawn or frightened kids who might be carrying secrets too heavy for their small shoulders. I never had direct confirmation, but I believe I may have saved a few children over the years simply by being alert to signs that others might have missed. My relationship with my parents, while loving, remained complicated by the guilt and regret they carried about their failure to protect me. They'd done their best with the knowledge and resources available to them, but the fact remained that the abuse had occurred in their home under their roof, while they remained oblivious to my suffering. "We should have known," my mother would say, sometimes tears in her eyes as she looked at me across the dinner table. "We should have seen the signs, should have protected you better." I learned to forgive them, and eventually to forgive myself. The blame belonged entirely to the man who had chosen to hurt a child, not to the child who had been hurt or the parents who had failed to recognize what was happening. Understanding that truth intellectually was one thing. Accepting it emotionally took many more years of therapy and self-reflection. Now, at 79, I look back on my life with a mixture of sadness and pride. Sadness for the childhood that was stolen from me, for the innocence that could never be reclaimed. But pride, too, in the woman I became despite that stolen childhood, in the life I built from the ruins of my early trauma. The scars remain, they always will. There are still nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, reliving moments I thought I'd forgotten. There are still situations that trigger memories of helplessness and fear. But those reactions are less frequent now, less intense, and I've learned to manage them without letting them control my life. To those of you who may be watching this video while living through your own nightmare, I want you to know that survival is possible. Healing is possible. The damage that has been inflicted on you is real and significant, but it doesn't have to define the rest of your life. Seek help. Tell someone you trust. Report the abuse to authorities who are better trained now than they were in my day to recognize and respond to such crimes. Most importantly, remember that none of this is your fault. You are not responsible for the actions of those who choose to hurt you. To the parents who might be watching, learn the signs of abuse. Trust your instincts if something seems wrong. Don't let social expectations or family dynamics prevent you from asking difficult questions or taking action to protect your children. And to anyone who might be tempted to hurt a child, know that you will be caught, you will be punished, and the damage you inflict will echo through generations. Choose differently. Seek help for your own problems before they become someone else's nightmare. This old grandmother's heart is full as I share these words with you. If my story helps even one person find the courage to speak up, to seek help, to believe in their own worth, then the pain I endured will have served a purpose. Thank you for listening, for caring, for being the kind of people who understand that some truths need to be told, no matter how difficult they are to hear. Please subscribe to this channel if my words have touched you, and share your own stories of survival in the comments. Together, we can build a community of healing and hope. Until next time, remember, there is always, always light at the end of the tunnel. This grandmother is living proof of that truth. The monsters may seem all-powerful in the darkness, but dawn always comes, and with it, the possibility of something better. God bless you all, and may you never lose hope, no matter how dark the night may seem.